Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online. We're going to be getting started in just a moment or so. We're letting in participants from the waiting room now. But if you're here for Strong Hearts and Healing Hands, Southern California Indians and Field Nurses, 1920 to 1950, you're in the right place. So just sit back, relax a minute, and we will be getting started shortly. Thanks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled Strong Hearts and Healing Hands, Southern California Indians and Field Nurses, 1920 to 1950. It's a live online presentation by Clifford E. Trafser, and we're going to be getting started in just a moment. We just opened up the waiting room for people to come into the presentation. We're going to give everyone a chance to settle down, and then we will be getting started. So just sit back and relax. We will be getting started in just a minute or so. And thanks again for your patience. Okay, it's a few minutes past the top of the hour, and I think we're going to get started for real this time. We'll let the people who are still in the waiting room or arriving late just join us in progress. So, good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled Strong Hearts and Healing Hands, Southern California Indians and Field Nurses, 1920 to 1950. It's a live online presentation by Clifford E. Trafser, author and distinguished professor of history and the Rupert Costo Chair in American Indian Affairs at the University of California, Riverside. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar. Tonight, we have more than 80 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The Book Club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. If you are not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. And we simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program title, Strong Hearts and Healing Hands, Southern California Indians and Field Nurses, 1920 to 1950. It is a live online presentation by Clifford E. Trafser. Again, he's the author of the book, and he's Distinguished Professor of History and the Rupert Costo Chair in American Indian Affairs at the University of California, Riverside. Before becoming an instructor in Navajo studies at Navajo Community College, now Diné College, he was an archivist and museum curator. He held professorships at Washington State University and San Diego State University before joining the faculty at the University of California, Riverside in 1991. In 2008, UC Riverside awarded him the Costo Chair in American Indian Affairs. In 2018, the Western History Association honored him with the Lifetime Achievement Award for his research and commitment to Native American people and communities. Cliff has published several books and articles, including Native Universe in 2004, the inaugural book of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, Exterminate Them, in 1999, Fighting Invisible Enemies, Health and Medical Transitions of Southern California Indians in 2019, Strong Hearts and Healing Hands, Southern California Indians and Field Nurses, 1920 to 1950, which was published in 2021, which is the focus of tonight's talk, and Willie Boy and the Last Western Manhunt in 2021, which includes a foreword from Jason Momoa. Tonight, Cliff is going to talk about an incredible period in California history, one that is captured in his book, Strong Hearts and Healing Hands. So for background, in 1924, the United States began a bold program in public health. The Indian Service of the United States hired its first nurses, a corps of white women who were dedicated to improving Indian health, to work among the Indians living on reservations. In 1928, the first field nurses arrived in the Mission Indian Agency of Southern California. These nurses visited homes and schools, providing public health and sanitation information regarding disease causation and prevention. I'm not going to say much more because I know that Clifford will. So I will say that with strong hearts, Indians eagerly participated in the tuberculosis campaign of 1939-1940 to X-ray tribal members living on 29 reservations. Through their cooperative efforts, Indians and healthcare providers decreased deaths, cases, and misery among the tribes of Southern California. So Cliff doesn't have a slideshow presentation to share with us. He is going to talk more about this incredible period in California history and about his book. So if you have questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the top of the hour to take questions, and I'll curate those from the Q&A and the chat. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Cliff Travser and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Cliff, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I want to thank all of you who have joined us this afternoon, this evening, because this is a topic near and dear to my heart that I've been working on since the 1990s. I'm speaking to you from Yucaipat. It is a small town near Palm Springs in the foothills of the mountains. And it is the homeland of the Gabrielenos, Tongva people, as well as Serrano people. It's a former village site here. And most of the inhabitants now are either on the Morongo Indian Reservation or at San Manuel today. So I got into this topic years ago when I was still a professor at Washington State University. I was interested in American Indian health, and I was in the National Archives in Seattle and had planned on doing a book on Yakima people, a tribal history, because I had done a previous book on the Palouse Indians, some of whom live on the Yakima Reservation. But as I was reading the materials, it was rote material. It was a lot of administrative material. And so I asked the archivist if they had any other documents other than those I was reading from the correspondence. And as I was going through these various documents, I saw a number of death certificates. And I thought, there were a lot of them, nearly 4,000 of them. And they were early 20th century to a 1964. And I thought, I would really like to get into this. So I Xeroxed some of them, took them back to San Diego State University, and met with a geographer who took a look at them and actually taught me how to put the materials together, how to make sense out of these unusual documents, these statistical studies. So I did a book called Death Stalks the Yakima: Epidemiological Transitions and Mortality on the Reservation, because there are a few studies in the United States about life on reservations. What was it like in the late 19th, early 20th century? And I thought that this would tell us something about Native health, and it certainly did. And then when I took the position at San Diego State University, I thought, well, I will do the same sort of study in California, among Southern California Indian people, but this time I wanted to spend a little more time doing oral interviews and learning from tribal elders. And so I got started in the 1980s and 1990s. And when I was in the National Archives that was once located at Laguna Niguel, now located in Riverside in Paris, closer to us, I started reading a number of letters and reports, and I wasn't sure where this had emerged from. And it emerged from a field nurse who was assigned to Southern California in 1928. And the more I read, the more details I found. And it was incredible, very detailed information, naming names, particularly of families, as some of whom I had known, because her area was from the Central Valley. There's just one reservation there, all the way over to the Santa Barbara region and all the way to the Mexican border. And it did not include the native people who were unrecognized along the coast of California in Los Angeles, Orange County, in that area. But it did include a large number of reservations, including 29 reservations in the inland area, but again, all the way down to the Mexican border. And I found this fascinating. And I started going back and then going forward, looking at these particular documents, and they were from field nurses. So I found a treasure trove. I found 20 years of documents from these field nurses from 1928 to about 1948. And they provided monthly reports, sometimes even more reports if there were particular things that they wanted to deal with. And so it got me started on this study, but I was busy doing other things, including teaching, and I did not have time to get to this study until I received a research grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I want to thank the National Endowment because their grant provided me a year off to really study the documents that I had collected over the years, as well as the oral interviews that I had taken over the years, and then be able to put it together. And the title of Strong Hearts comes from an association with the Quetzan tribal people. I had a project with the Quetzans, with the cultural committee of the tribe, to study sacred lands that are on a military base, the Yuma Proving Ground. And while I was there, I was visiting with a teacher who was a Quetzan member, and he invited me to come to a powwow one night. And he had an organization that he called the Strong Hearts, and these were boys and girls who worked together to make the school better, to make their community better. I thought, well, this is a wonderful title to use in a book, and a way of describing all Southern California Indians who work collectively with the nurses and the doctors to improve Indian health here in Southern California. So I want to back up to 1922. Some of you know that there was a Teapot Dome scandal in the United States with the Secretary of Interior messing around with the oil business, and ended up being fired. And a new Secretary of Interior came in 1922. His name was Hubert Work. He was a medical doctor, and he was head of the AMA at one time. He was a former colonel in the United States Army, and he had served in World War I. And during his service overseas, he had worked with many nurses and knew how they improved improved health just generally among the soldiers, and was impressed by the work of nurses. And so when he became the Secretary of Interior, he was in charge of the Indian Service. And the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from the past to the 1920s had not hired nurses to be working in the public health realm. Instead, they were hiring matrons who were more or less like home ec teachers. And a good core of women who did that extremely well, but they were not trained as registered nurses. And the more work got into Indian health and was studying it, the more he felt like there was a great need for public health nurses. And indeed, he decided he would move forward with this project. So he went to the United States public health, not the Public Health Service, but to the folks who studied public health in the various cities of the eastern part of the United States, and asked them, if you were to hire somebody to do a study of the possible need for nurses on reservation, who would you select? And overwhelmingly, people said you need to look to Florence Patterson. Florence Patterson was also a World War I veteran. A lot of the early field nurses were World War I veterans, and they had been off to see the elephant and come home, and they learned a great deal during World War I about public health and how to care for people and how to organize in major ways. So Florence Patterson went back and forth whether or not she would take on this job, because she was well established in Boston, and decided that she would do this. And so she, in 1922, between 1922 and 24, she went to several reservations in Utah and Colorado, in New Mexico and Arizona, and then Southern California to our Mission Indian Agency here, our Southern California agency. And during her visits to various reservations and boarding schools, she was taking copious notes, only a few of which I have been able to find. But she wrote a dynamite study and delivered it in 1924 to the Office of Indian Affairs. And after the commissioner and the head of the medical division took a look at it, they decided they would hide this report, because it was a condemnation of Indian health and what was happening on the reservations. And without naming names, often I can tell where she was at the time and which boarding school she was talking about, and then telling us about conditions on the reservation. And then most particular is the focus on tuberculosis, which was the number one killer of Native Americans in the early 20th century. And the Congress over the years provided very little money to fight TB on the reservations. But Work was interested in this part of her study, particularly when she would explain that at the boarding schools, they would keep children until they had to send them home, and then send them home at the last moment. And then Patterson tells us within an hour after arriving home, a child would die, or a week later, a child would die, and so on. That she could record this, and it made the Indian office look terrible, that they were keeping these kids. They were keeping them in part because the schools were paid per student. So they wanted to keep as many students there as possible. But by sending them back to their reservations, they would spread the disease to their parents and to their friends and those people who might tend to this child as the child was dying. And so this was a report that the Indian Office did not want to publish. And so in 1924, when she turned it in, no one could see it. And a number of letters came into the Indian office saying, hey, this woman was here. She wrote this report. And we would like to see this report, but they refused to publish it. They refused to send copies of it to anyone. And this was not made public until 1928 when the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs learned that this report existed. And they had Florence Patterson come in and testify. Unfortunately, we have the testimony of Florence Patterson as well as her report now, which is a condemnation of the Indian office. But it also spurred the Secretary of Interior to tell the Commissioner of Indian Affairs that he would hire 2 nurses, and they were going to have an experiment of having public health nurses on reservations. And so they placed one nurse among the Jicarilla Apaches of northern New Mexico, and the other one among the Lakota people at the Rosebud and Pine Ridge reservation, and that was Eleanor Gregg. Eleanor Gregg and Stoll were both World War I nurses. And so they had dealt with bureaucracies, and they had dealt with medical doctors who were overbearing. They had dealt with the United States Army, and so they had a lot of experience. Well, these 2 nurses did a bang-up job between 1922 and 1924, and Work decided that he was going to create a nursing corps, and he asked Eleanor Gregg to head it up. So Eleanor Gregg, Nurse Gregg, left the Lakota reservations, went to Washington, D.C., and she was probably the only woman administrator in the Indian office. And so she had to deal with a lot of sexism, but she took it in stride. Now, Eleanor Gregg wrote a book about this. It's one of the few accounts that we have by a field nurse about her time on the Lakota reservations as well as in Washington, D.C., as she pulled together 650 nurses to work on different reservations. This was a remarkable turn of events because public health nurses would end up in everybody's home on the reservation. And they had to have some skills, human skills, because of all that had happened in the past. You can imagine a white woman. They were all white women, no people of color. It's unclear to me why they were not selecting African-American nurses or other women, but they selected only white women, and most of whom had no experience dealing with Native Americans at all. And you can imagine them on a reservation, knocking on a door, introducing themselves, going to tribal leaders on different reservations, introducing themselves and trying to explain what it is that they do. But what happened initially was there was some pushback because some nurses were interested in assimilation and Christianization. And some of the tribal people were not interested in assimilation or Christianity. But over the years, what I see in the documents is that there was a greater emphasis on health, Indian health, rather than caring about assimilation. And in fact, the nurses and the nursing corps in all regions had to bend with the tribal people. In Southern California, for example, every summer when the nurses would go to reservations, people often were not in their homes. They had gone to other reservations to the fiestas. These were big times, a lot of fun on different reservations, and different reservations would host them, not every year, but periodically. And when they did, they hosted everyone and had people come in, and there was singing and dancing, some traditional medicine taking place. And initially the nurses were upset about this, but eventually they decided to join in and started sending a large tent to these affairs, and then having free clinics, bringing people in. It could be an eye clinic, it could be physicals, it could be for elders, it could be for pregnant women to come in and receive some help from the field nurses. So they joined in. But our first field nurse in Southern California came in 1928. Her name was Florence McClintock. And Florence had some experience, unlike most of them. She had worked in New Mexico among Apaches and at Zuni and Mescalero Apache as well. So she had some experience dealing with Native Americans, and you see this in her letters. When she arrives in 1928, she says early on in her letters to the commissioner and to the superintendency here that she is going to focus on women and children, because women control the families and the children, and so grandmother's interest becomes her interest. She goes to the older women and listens to them about what they need and how best to serve their families. So Florence McClintock could not deal with all of Southern California. Most of you know it's a huge geographical area. But she dealt with the northern part of the Mission Indian Agency. That would be from the San Bernardino Mountains all the way out into the desert to the Torres Martinez Reservation, all the way out to 29 Palms, and then south to the Mexican border. She would not usually go that far south, but she would go to the San Luis Rey River. So that part of the reservations among Luiseños, Cahuilla people, Serrano people, and some Chemehuevis, she would administer to them. And you can imagine such a large area with so many reservations in our area that she couldn't possibly spend a lot of time on each reservation. But she would let people know that she was coming, and she would send notices, she'd send letters and let them know that she would be there at certain times. And then she would go into the various homes, and then periodically the nurses, not just McClintock, but the other nurses that followed her, would set up little tables and little verandas and meet in different places, and they would hold clinics and urge people to bring the infirm to them, and they would have clinics for them. Sometimes it was a dental clinic, and so people would show up, and a dentist would arrive with the nurse to go and help the people. And what I see in the letters also is a couple of things: a formation of friendship. A real bond developed between the nurses and the tribal communities. And the other thing is that Native people continue to use their traditional medicines. That would be shamanistic medicine as well as herbal medicines. They continued to do that, but they also started to open up and incorporate Western medicine as well. Some years ago, it was in 1999, I was at California State University at San Bernardino. The Seminole tribe offers a gathering for children for a week-long gathering to have kids come in, busloads of kids, and then they would go to different stations. And in my station, they would learn about a little bit of history. And over here, they might learn a little bit of basketry or pottery making or storytelling or singing over here, the bird songs. Well, there were two elders sitting at a table, and they had around them all these baskets that their mother and grandmother had made in the 19th and early 20th century, and different foods that they used to use a great deal. Anyway, I went up to these two ladies. One was Pauline Murillo from San Manuel, and her mother, Martha Chacon. And I visited with them, introduced myself, and I eventually got around to telling them I was working on these field nurses. And Martha, the elder, in her late 80s or early 90s, started digging in her purse and ultimately pulled out a picture of her family with a field nurse and Dr. Evans. It's like the cover of the book. That's not the exact picture, but it is like that. And she held it up, and she had been keeping it since 1936 and said, these were the nicest people. They helped us so much. They cared about us. And I would hear this from different elders on different reservations, that the people administering Western medicine were not pushing it on them as a means of assimilation, but rather as a way of helping people. And to be a genuine urged, and one in Native American history that we don't run into often enough. And so this was a very pleasant task to learn from tribal elders, to learn from the documents. And it also told me that over the years that the number of deaths and the crude death rate declined. Fortunately, the Indian office kept the death certificates and birth certificates from 1922 to 1946-47. And so I had these to work from, and I quantified all of the death documents, and it told me, the ages of people dying. It told me what the causes of death were in many cases. There was a high number of people who died from tuberculosis. So it becomes the number one issue on our reservations here in Southern California. It does not start out to be a major issue in the late 1920s and 30s, but during the 30s, more and more and more, you read about the numbers of people with TB, and the nurses are in everybody's homes, and they are recording, who has the disease and what treatment. And so the treatment at the time, there was no streptomycin, there was no antibiotic. And so the procedure was to try to remove a tubercular patient from the home, which was very difficult, especially if it was a child. In Southern California, we had a sanitarium for tuberculosis at the Phoenix Indian School. It was a separate part of the Indian School called the East Farm. And so lots of times the nurses would propose to the mothers and the grandmothers, to the family, that their child be sent over there, and through rest and diet, perhaps they could make it. If it was an elder, many times the nurses would encourage the family to have the grandma or the grandpa move to another place outside of the home. So they would help build little shacks out back, or an area that is covered near the home, but it's outside of the home where everyone else was living. And that this seemed to help, and there was some declining of tuberculosis, but not sufficient to conquer the disease. It was a field nurse a new field nurse in the late 1930s. Her name was Bertha Lips. And for some reason, she took it upon herself to go into Riverside, California, and meet with the director of the Riverside Health Department. And Dr. Hoffman brought her in. They became friends. He started inviting her to staff meetings, and she would go down to the staff meetings. This is all aside from being an Indian Service federal nurse. And it was unusual because many times the county governments, the city governments, and the state governments wanted nothing to do with Native Americans because they were wards of the federal government. So the feds ought to be taking care of them, not the local people. But she formed this relationship, and in 1939, the summer, the director wrote her a letter saying, we're going to have the tuberculosis truck, the X-ray truck, the mobile unit out at Banning. And you have mentioned that you have some children that you suspect have tuberculosis. Why don't you bring them and come there? And then she received a letter, and so did the Indian Agency, from the head of the TB anti-TB unit, or the tuberculosis fighting unit of the state of California, offering to do the same thing. So she brought over 50 children to Banning to have their chest x-rayed. And then some of the adults learned about it, probably parents, and so they showed up as well. And the state did not send them away. They went ahead and shot their x-rays as well. And so this planted a seed in the minds of the people in the county and the state that, Native people don't stay on the reservations. They work all over Southern California. And if they have tuberculosis, they could spread TB to others in their workforce. So the head of the state agency and the state public health office decided that they would offer their truck to come to Southern California in December of 1939 and January of 1940 and go to every reservation then in the Mission Indian Agency, beginning with Santa Ynez above Santa Barbara, and then going to San Bernardino to the people of San Manuel, then out to Banning to the people of Morongo, Palm Springs, and so on. And ultimately, they went to every reservation and took chest X-rays of every Native person that they could possibly bring in. And the nurses, their job was to go out, visit with people, and encourage them to come in and bring people in. They would have their cars and they would bring people to the sites where the X-rays are being taken. At the same time, the Bureau also, this is very unusual, assigned 3 medical doctors who had experience working on tuberculosis. They were TB specialists to come to Southern California, and a nurse who was also trained at the Phipps Center at the University of Pennsylvania. The Phipps Center was dedicated to the prevention and the stoppage of tuberculosis. And so a nurse and an Indian service nurse and an Indian service doctor read all of the X-rays. And they did this at the Saboba Indian Hospital on the Saboba Indian Reservation. It's a very small hospital, but one that the tribal people today are very proud of, having their own hospital. It began in 1928 and was closed in 1948. I'll get to that part of the story in a minute. But they looked at these X-rays. They X-rayed the children, the students at Sherman Institute, our off-reservation Indian boarding school. And then they would do rechecks. They would go and find people and recheck them if there were fuzzy X-rays, or they questioned whether or not they were seeing TB. And so there was a follow-up. And this was the first time in the history of Southern California Indians that this had ever happened, that the federal government really took it upon itself, and the state of California and the counties of Riverside and San Diego participated in this. And we see the effects of it in the death documents, because the deaths declined dramatically in the 1940s as a result of this joint effort. So what was the conclusion of this? For 20 years, these field nurses, different field nurses, had worked among the tribes. There was a segment in the northern part of the Mission Indian Agency and the southern part down the San Diego area. They had their own corps of nurses as well. And then in the 1940s, some of you will know that there was a backlash to the New Deal, including the Indian New Deal and the Wheeler-Howard Act. And the reaction then by conservative Republicans in the House and in the Senate was to cut back funding on Indian affairs. And the old slogan in 1946 was, "Have you had enough? Had enough of this? Had enough of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal?" And so they started cutting back on Indian appropriations. And a new idea sprung up to terminate Indian tribes, get rid of them. Abrogate the treaties, abrogate the executive orders that created reservations, and just get out of the Indian business. And one of the ways to do that was to cut spending dramatically. Under Truman's administration, as well as Eisenhower's administration, cutting funding for Indian health. And here in Southern California, in the nation, what happened was that the Congress decided to get rid of the Indian Service Medical Division. And so they did. And then they said that they turned it all over to the Public Health Service through the Indian Health Service in 1954 and 55. But here locally, and doing oral interviews, tells me that the whole system collapsed after 1948. So the federal government closed the Saboba Hospital. They fired all of the medical doctors. They got rid of all of the field nurses. and they stopped providing any Indian health to the local Indian people. And if they were to receive any help, they might get it through the county, or they might be able to get to the hospital at the Sherman Institute, but most likely they went without, or they paid for it themselves. And so the robust medical division that had emerged in the 1930s and 1940s, the decline in Indian deaths and the crew death rates, that all collapsed. And then after in 1954, we don't have the documents to support what happens with Indian health in the aftermath of this era. And it's a real tragedy. I just have one statistic to share with you to show you the importance of this effort that was made by the federal government and later by the state and county government. Between 1925 and 1927, the accrued death rate, the average accrued death rate per 100,000 was 415 among the tribes of Southern California. In the United States, all races, of course, a much larger population, the accrued death rate was 92. So 415, 92. But in 1943 to 1946, the accrued death rate to tuberculosis per 100,000 among the tribes of Southern California dropped to 46. Dropped to 90. There was a huge drop. And then for the United States, it had dropped to 4 per 100,000. Although the stats show us there's still a larger number of deaths being caused by TB compared to the U.S. all races, nevertheless, it dropped dramatically, and the whole number of people just drops to very few people. And then you know that in the 1950s, then streptomycin is finally used widely. And I cannot tell you, and I wish I could, to what effect does streptomycin help our local Native people who still had tuberculosis? I can't say because the statistics aren't there, not through the Indian Service at least. So I must conclude by saying this. I am really impressed by these field nurses. They are heroic to me. At least those people working in Southern California, they were able to be pragmatic and bend to the times. They did not push assimilation or Christianity to any great extent, but they formed these friendships, lifelong friendships, some of which exist today. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm back. I'm back. You ended so quickly. I was taking a note. I have many notes and many questions for our conversation. And I'll start by first telling the audience out there, if you have any questions or comments for Cliff, please use the chat and the Q&A function. I'm going to look in there to see what you might be saying or thinking or want me to pass on to Cliff as he takes a drink of water there. I'm going to say, first of all, thank you so much for sharing all of your research and these oral histories on the health of the Southern California Indians during the early 1900s, 1920 to 1950. I think even today we hear a lot about health disparities for Indigenous people, and it looks like these challenges have long existed, right? Long-standing challenges that we are still faced with today. And you shared such incredible stories of the healthcare work itself, the workers and the conditions, and all things, honestly, that were really new to me. I hadn't thought much about this topic and these people, except for the book club recently had another talk about sanatoriums and tuberculosis in California. So this kind of fits with an earlier presentation that we had. And I now just have so many questions about these people and these processes and about you. So I'm going to let some people put some stuff in the chat and the Q&A, and I'm going to start with something that I didn't really mention, and I don't think you mentioned, was I wanted to ask you, and if you would share with the audience your Indian background, because I think people might be interested in knowing what your background
Well,
is.
thank you. Well, I'm not an enrolled member of the Wyandot tribe, but I was. My mother's father was native, and his father on that side of the family. And so, as a child, I was always interested in Native American history, all sorts of Native American history. And then, when I was a kid, we moved to Yuma, Arizona. And my mother let all the kids know that we're moving into the homelands of other folks. They are the Quetzans people, and that you should always know that wherever you are, it's somebody's homeland, and you should recognize them. And so my heritage has led me to become a historian of Native American history. And when I was an undergraduate at Northern Arizona University, I had a very close friend who was Navajo, and the documents there in special collections was about the Navajo tribe, and so I wrote my master's thesis on Navajo people, and it just got me down that pathway of studying Native history. Wherever I am, I'd like to know who are the people there, and know that I'm in their homeland. That's why I began the lecture mentioning I'm in Yucaipat. In the early 20th century, a farmer came to that Indian village, and he loaded all the people up. He forced a removal, and then took them down to Morongo and just dumped them and told them, "You're not wanted here any longer." And that's not so long ago. And it wasn't the national government. It was just a local person who decided to do this, that he didn't want Indians around in Yucaipa any longer. But their village site is still here, and it has not been developed, and there are burials there. So anyway, that's led me down this path of working in Native American history, and it's been rich because not only are you working in the archives and learning in special collections, but you're working with community people and listening and learning from them, and what you receive from them is information you can find no other place. It's just, I feel like my life has been enriched by the things that people have shared, like Martha Chacon just sharing about a field nurse and Dr. Evans. I'll add to that by saying I attended her wake. In our area, there's all-night sings to send people to heaven. And so I went to her wake, and then a tribal member came up to me and said, "Oh, I understand you're studying the, Dr. Evans and Nurse Kauser and these field nurses." And I said, "Yes." And he says, Dr. Evans used to come up to our reservation in the early 20th century before ever being paid for it, and offer to do clinics. And when he died, our tribe sent down 6 men, and we asked the family if we could carry his casket in honor of Dr. Evans and the gift that he had given us. Well, it's just so remarkable, and that's the kind of information. It's the kind of data you won't find in the National Archives, and so working with communities creates friendships, lifelong friendships that have meaning to me.
Yeah, that is, I took a great note about that. Pauline and Martha, right?
Yes.
That's a terrific story about how she carried that picture, for decades, right? In her purse, and she still had it with her. And that, like you said, that shows the power of oral interviews and sourcing and accomplishing your research.
Right.
Yeah.
Kevin, when I first started as a historian, I received an evaluation of a book manuscript through the University of Oklahoma. It was the second read, and whoever wrote that review said that I had to get rid of all the oral interviews and all the traditional stories that I'd used to incorporate. And because he or she said, as we know, they're all fish tales that grow with the telling.
Mhm.
In other words, they're just lies. They're just not to be trusted. And there's been a real change over the years. I've been doing this a long time, and there has been a change now where there's a greater acceptance of oral interviews and the use of those in academic writing. Thank goodness.
Yeah, thank goodness. We're actually experiencing that a little bit at the book club as well. We started, our librarian, who I think is on this call listening, has started an oral history project to kind of capture the history of the book club, of our publications and our program.
That's great.
So
think of how many programs you've had, how many authors you've had, how many books. That's just rich.
Yeah,
and I agree.
Yeah, oral history has moved from don't use it, it's not worth anything, it's not true, to kind of center stage. And I love that you've taken advantage of that. But you've also, this is so interesting that you started your talk talking about these death certificates and all of the information that you can get from a death certificate. You were talking, I was like, why is he talking about death certificates? And then you actually said you find out how old people are when they died, what they died of, all of this valuable information. So and also, so I guess the three core pieces of information that you've used to pull this together were oral histories, you have death certificates, you have the actual notes, like notebooks from these field nurses.
Right. So they would write monthly reports. And then sometimes in between they would be writing letters, but they might also write a report. And then there were district doctors for the Indian service. One was in San Francisco, and he would visit periodically and then make an evaluation of what was happening here from the documents that he could see here. What I don't have are patient records, though. If the nurse writes in the monthly report and talks about an individual or a family, then I have that information. But there are no patient reports,
like charts or
charts and things, to track people over time. And that kind of tracking at the end of the book, I do track some of the people with tuberculosis who refuse to go to a sanitarium or to stay isolated, and they continued to visit with people and spread the disease, which very similar to what we're living through now. And so then the Indian service would take a heavy hand and get Indian policemen to go visit with them and urge them, you can't do this because you're spreading the disease to other families.
Right.
And only in a few cases did they incarcerate people. Actually, say, okay, it's like an arrest. We're going to send you to a SAN because you can't keep doing this.
Yeah, a forced quarantine kind of way, arrest.
Right.
So where are these notebooks and these journals or diaries? Where are they held? Are they in collections? Are they in libraries? Or are they at the government level? Like, how did you get access to them?
They're in National Archives, and we have a National Archives Center in Riverside now. And when I gathered the documents, the National Archives was at Laguna Niguel, to the west of us, near the coast, near San Juan Capistrano. But they moved that facility out this way and built a very large federal building that contains all kinds of documents, including all of the documents from Arizona. So the U.S. Marshals documents are there. The Coast Guard material is there. U.S. Navy materials. I mean, you name it. If it's a federal document, they've collected it there. But we have those throughout the United States in different places. Besides the major one, well, there are two facilities in Washington and in Maryland, the National Archives. So there are documents there as well. There are so many, ladies and gentlemen. The archivist at the National Archives when I visited there was a graduate of the University of California, Riverside, and anyway, he took me back into the stacks to show me how huge the collection was. And it's I forget how many feet long, and it goes from the floor up to the ceiling. It's just a huge collection. So finding things many times is like a needle in the haystack. They do have some finding aids, but they're not they're not as precise as many special collections that you would find in the United States. Yeah.
So there's a couple of questions people have chatted directly to me or in the group chat about the women who became these nurses. So you mentioned that they were all white nurses. You're not quite sure why they didn't really recruit women of color, but can you remind us about their training or lack of training, or and where they came from, where they found this core of caring nurses?
Well, the nurses could come from all over. They had to be registered nurses. They had to be graduates of a fully accredited college or university. Okay. And so there were different nursing colleges, but also, say, at the University of Pennsylvania, they had a premier nursing program and have for years and years. And so they were all registered nurses, which is amazing. And they all focused on public health, because you can specialize as a nurse and do different things. But these women were primarily public health nurses to go into homes and see the problems that was all around them, whether it was issues of spitting. If you have somebody with tuberculosis and they're spitting on the floor, and the floor has dust on it, picks up the bacteria and carries it, then people breathe that in, as we all see dust particles in our homes even today. So, or the outhouses. So they would inspect outhouses and then make suggestions. You really need 4 sides, and you have a window here, but you need some screening on it because the flies come in and they collect this stuff, and then they take it out. It's just not tuberculosis. They're interested in all kinds of things. And then they serve as surgical nurses periodically at the Saboba Hospital and at Riverside Hospital, to assist doctors, or they'll help deliver babies in the home, or they'll take them to the Saboba Hospital and help there. There was a time when the Indian Service, including here in Southern California, got into the business of doing grattage. It was from trachoma in the eyes. And so they would strap people down, pull their eyelids up, and take a toothbrush and scrape them. It was a terrible thing. And it really didn't do the trick, and it could really do harm. Yeah. So one of the elders who helped me was Catherine Sobel, who died at 92. She's a Kuya elder. And she told me that when she was in high school in Palm Springs, that they called her in, and she didn't have trachoma, but they did this to her anyway. And she explained that they would strap her down on this table, and a nurse was there and a doctor was there, and they'd pull the eyelids up with forceps and hold them up and then scrape the top of the eyelids. Things like that. But if whatever was needed, they would help out. One of the things I didn't mention was that the nurses were concerned that people didn't have enough blankets and they didn't have enough clothing. Especially children didn't have shoes and they didn't have socks, and they didn't have coats in the winter. And so I have this letter in which one of the field nurses wrote to the Indian Service saying, we really need to help the people because they don't have basic clothing and bedding, and had a list of things that were needed on a particular reservation. It came to $23.22. It was something ridiculous. And at the bottom of the letter, the Indian Service sent it back and says, your business is one of Indian health, not of, helping Indians in this way. You're not a social service. Yeah. And so the nurses went to the local churches, and they did this in San Diego as well, would ask the churches if they had rummage sales, if you have clothing and things, if you would please give them to us and we'll take them to the reservations. Nice. And so like Martha Chacon had a treadle sewing machine, and Pauline told me that she was so proud that her mother could take the used clothing and then reshape it so that they fit the family and they look nice, where other people didn't have treadle machines and
Mhm.
looked like ragamuffins. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's some questions. I think you mentioned it because public health is such a large field. They're dealing with all kinds of, health issues, but I'm guessing they also address things like maybe hypertension, diabetes,
Yep.
alcoholism, other, you know,
Yes.
conditions.
And also there would be outbreaks of bacterial diseases from the water on different reservations because of the cattle and horses, and, defecating into water systems. So the nurses then would bring in specialists to test the water and then make recommendations about what needed to be happen. And one of the field nurses, McClintock, ended up with a bad disease, a bacterial disease, and she became very ill and had to take some time off. But you're absolutely right. Any issue that dealing with public health could be an issue that the nurses dealt with. McClintock made a mistake at one of the fiestas by reporting that Indians were drinking, and yeah, it's during Prohibition.
Yeah.
And so Prohibition officers came in and they arrested a number of people,
Oh.
and it was because she had reported on them. And you can imagine, how the community felt about that. If they found out, it's unclear, did they really know who turned them in?
Yeah. Ooh,
Yeah.
that's a touchy
But
area.
concerned about alcoholism, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's still a big concern today. Depression, all of those
Yeah.
mental health issues are
Right.
also kind of.
All kinds of diseases. Yeah.
So we're at the top of the hour, but there's a couple of questions I want to get in here before I close up. And one of them has to do with the kind of, this is Western medicine coming into a reservation, and Indigenous peoples have their own ways, right? Their own medicine
Yes.
treatments. How did that go down? Like, was it conflict, cooperation, compromise, a little of all of that?
Yeah. Well, at first there is opposition. You see it when the nurses complain, when different people refuse to listen to them. Use this medicine on your children because they have scabies. And rather than using it, the kids still had the scabies, and so she was frustrated about it. And then McClintock once writes about someone at Torres Martinez, some woman at Torres Martinez reservation, which is a desert Kuya reservation, that she kept telling this woman to quit wasting her money preparing for the fiestas, because she would use her money to host everybody who came to the fiesta. And so they would buy gifts for them, and they would buy food, so that they would host them. And the woman would look at her and smile and go about her business and ignore her. And that really made her angry. Yeah. So, but you're absolutely right. And then sometimes a nurse will write that an individual, something happened to a child, and the child was doctored by a shaman and it didn't work, and the child ended up dying, and that the nurse wished that the child had been taken, in a different route into Western medicine. But, there's a great deal of sovereignty during the 1920s and 30s, and the tribes would decide for themselves, the families would decide what was best for them. Whether you and I would think that was such a wise decision or not, that's what they would decide.
Yeah.
But also in the first part of the book, I use some examples of natives writing. That is, Kathy Sobel and Pauline, they wrote books. And these books tell us about native medicine. And Kathy said that I think it was the measles she had. I can't remember. She has some disease and goes to a shaman, and he bakes her, meaning that he digs a hole, builds a fire, puts sand in there, and then put her in there, and then put this creosote all around her. And that something there helped cure her. At least she got better. Right. And then she also provides another incident where she had a really terrible earache, and how a shaman helped cure the earache. So Yes, they use traditional medicine, but more and more you see that there's an interest in Western medicine. And I think it's in part because of the efficacy of Western medicine. There is an account of a nurse, and now she was a Native American nurse, not a field nurse, and she had been working in New Mexico. And she came home to take care of her father who was aging, and he was blind from cataracts. So she took him into the Mercy Hospital in San Diego, and he had cataract surgery. So this old man who had been blind comes home and he can see. And this the word gets around to multiple reservations in San Diego County that, wow, there is some value in what these guys are doing.
Yeah, in that situation, there's no greater endorsement of Western medicine than someone coming back and being able to see. Yeah, success. So there is a question, and I was wondering if you can give us a little. I have a ton of questions about all of these entities that have been involved. I mean, but we'll do this offline because nobody else cares probably but me. You have the Office of Indian Affairs, the Department of Health, the U.S. Army, the Mission Indian Agency. So many players. It just seems like a cluster. And surprised that anything got done, but we can talk about that later because I have other questions. There is this question about, so what is the state of the situation now in Southern California? What tribes are there? And what are the health institutions and services that are available to them?
Sure. Well, I mentioned that things collapsed with the federal government in 1948. And then there was not an Indian clinic in Southern California until the 1970s. And that Indian clinic at Morongo took place because the tribal people decided they would create one. And so, and I think they work with the Moravian Church too, to receive some funding and help. And so they set up their first clinic in Southern California. So what has happened since then is that the tribes have formed consortiums, health consortiums. In my area, it's the Riverside San Bernardino Indian Health, and they have clinics throughout our area, our inland area here. And in San Diego, they have northern San Diego County Indian Health, and then Southern California or Southern San Diego County Indian Health as well. These are all consortiums made up of tribal members from representatives from all of the tribes being represented, and then they run the clinic. And then they hire a director, they hire medical doctors, they hire nurses, and so on. And they receive money from the Indian Health Service. So the federal government provides them, they have to apply for this. And this is what we're going to do with the money. And then they decided, though, how they were going to run these. So they're not Indian Health Service federal employees. From the federal government. They are controlled by the local Native people, and it's a robust healthcare system. But it's also limited. It's robust in some ways, meaning that we have these clinics all over, but they're limited in what they can do. These are small clinics. So the major surgeries, that's a different issue that they have to go through to get the help that they need. Yeah, and I was just talking to someone the other day about this that one of the problems is that they are not all linked, say like through computer system. So if I am a Kumeyaay from San Diego County and I'm at Morongo attending something and I get bit by a rattlesnake and I'm taken to the clinic there, they don't have my record there. They don't have this online connection that could really be helpful, and that may come in the future, but it's more money. A lot depends on administrations and what's in the federal budgets for the Indian Health Service, whether it's up or down, if there's much concern about it or not. But we did see the efficacy during COVID on the Navajo reservation. They were hit terribly hard initially. It's a huge reservation. It's bigger than the state of West Virginia. and they needed help, and they jumped on it themselves. Navajo Health Authority took care of that. Excuse me. And then they got the funding, and then they got the vaccinations in. They have nearly 100% of their people all vaccinated with both shots.
Wow.
So they went from a terrible situation to a very strong situation, but that's not necessarily true on all reservations.
Yeah. So there's a lot of great comments in the chat and the Q&A that I will send you afterwards, because some of them are very specific. People telling you kind of what they're working on to see if you're interested in learning more, or they might have a particular question for you. So I'll definitely share all of that with you. And for those of you who are still on the presentation, which is a good number of you, I will be sending out an email tomorrow with a link with more information about Cliff. It's basically your web pages about your university work and your publications, but also a link to buy the book if people are interested in purchasing the book from the publisher. There will be a link in that email that will go out tomorrow, so you can look for that. And maybe look for an email from Cliff if he gets back to you, or gets back to me with some answers to your questions, and I'll follow up with you. But we are a little past 6 o'clock, about 6:10. So this is the time we would usually wrap up. I will tell you that there's some great comments in the chat. Thanks for a great presentation. Wonderful presentation. So informative. Glad I could make it. Very interesting work. And thanks for all you do. True heroes. Alan, who's probably still here, you called these nurses heroes earlier on, and he echoes it. I was going to say, to close, thank you so much for sharing these stories and these histories of the incredible women, right? Strong hearts, I think is what you call them, like Eleanor. Great names too. Eleanor, Florence, Bertha, such classic names. But they're crucial work in the Southern California, with the Southern California Indigenous people. And again, you called them heroes. I think we would all agree that they are heroes. And everyone here should be a hero and a strong heart, like these women, making everyone's lives better. So thank you, Clifford, so much for joining us this evening. This was terrific. And thank you, everyone, for attending this Book Club of California program. Please join us for our next online program, which is titled Collecting the COVID Era? ? It's on Monday, June 28th, 1 week from tonight, from 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. It's going to be a live online presentation by Randall Tarpey Schwed. He's an author, he's a collector, and he's the past president of the Book Club of California. And he's going to talk about the who, what, where, when, and why of collecting the COVID era. So hopefully you can join us for that, again, 1 week from tonight. You can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs, or you can use the link in the program's emails that you're probably getting from the Book Club of California now. You'll be in next week, you'll get a couple emails about that, and you'll be able to register. So again, Cliff, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Thanks, everyone.
It's an honor.
I'll give you a second to say a few words.
Yeah, I would just say thank you so much for inviting me. It's always an honor to share. I love what I do, and I love to share this information with people. An unusual topic.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'll also tell you, the audience who's still here, Cliff told me when he started, he had 1 page of handwritten notes to kind of keep him on track and guide him for the 45 minutes. That was incredible that you could deliver that kind of detailed information and history of these great people with 1 short page of notes. That's incredible. So
thanks much.
Thanks, Clifford. Thanks everyone for joining us. Hopefully you'll be able to join us again soon. Have a great night. Bye now.
Bye now.